Hello, this is video 3 out of 3 videos on supply and demand. And in this video, we're going to put the demand curve and the supply curve together and look at what's called the law of supply and demand. And we'll find the equilibrium where the two curves cross. Then we'll look at what happens if we're not at that equilibrium point, where there's a surplus or a shortage, and then see what happens in some examples when the supply changes or the demand changes and how that changes the equilibrium. Okay. We have a demand curve, and price is on the vertical axis. The quantity demanded is on the horizontal axis. Demand curves slope downward. That's the law of demand. Now, when it comes to supply, once again, price on the vertical axis. Quantity supplied, which is a quantity, is on the horizontal axis. We can draw the supply curve, and the law of supply curve is that supply curves slope upward. Now, right here where they cross is referred to as an equilibrium. And I'll write that as P star and Q star, quantity star. We can solve for that. If we know the equations of demand and supply, we can solve for the equilibrium, the point at where they meet, or we can just plot it on a graph and look where the two curves cross, and that's the equilibrium point. This point here is where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. It's not where demand equals supply. Remember, demand is an equation going down. Supply is an equation of a curve sloped up. They're not the same. They're never going to be. But there is a point that they each have in common, a quantity that they have in common. Right there where they cross, their quantities are the same. Now, if the curves never intersect each other, then we're just not going to have a market for that good or service. But if they intersect each other, then we should be able to have some sort of market and an equilibrium price and an equilibrium quantity. At this price and quantity, there's no pressure for anything to change, which is why it's called an equilibrium. Now, suppose the price is above equilibrium. Suppose that we pick a price, say P1, and it's greater than P star. What's going to happen? Well, let's pick this price right here. We'll call it P1. If the price is P1 in this market, we can go over here to see what the demand is. Come down here on the graph and say, well, the quantity demanded is right here at price P1. We'll call it QD1. If we go over here to the supply curve, we can see what the quantity supplied is going to be. We'll call that quantity supplied 1, QS1. We can see that they're not the same. More is being supplied than people want to buy. We can measure that amount. It's this horizontal distance right in here between the two graphs. It's QS1 minus QD1. That horizontal distance, this distance right here between these two. More is being supplied than people want to buy, and that is known as a surplus. If there's a surplus in the market, that means sellers are making things they can't sell. And there's some pressure on them to lower their prices. So prices start to fall towards equilibrium. And as prices start to fall, there's a movement along the supply curve, not a shift in the supply curve, but a movement along the supply curve down. And there's a movement along the demand curve down. As the prices fall, less sellers want to sell as much. As the price falls, buyers increase the quantity that they want to buy. And we can continue that story all the way down until we get to equilibrium. And then there's no more pressure for prices to fall. So the price is above equilibrium, we end up with a surplus that can be measured by the quantity supplied minus the quantity demanded. And there's pressure on prices to fall for price to fall to the equilibrium price, which is P star. Now, what about if the price is below equilibrium? We can tell a very similar story. Say the price is P0, down here, way down here. This is P0. And we can go over here to the supply curve and see what the quantity supplied is going to be. We'll call that QS, quantity supplied 0, at price 0. We can go over here to the demand curve and see how many people, or what the quantity is, the people wish to buy. We'll call that QD, quantity demanded 0. We can see that the quantity that people want to buy is much greater than the quantity that sellers want to sell. In fact, that distance is this horizontal in here between the demand curve and the supply curve. So if the price is below equilibrium, we'll say P0 is less than P star. People want to buy them. There's not enough to buy. We refer to that as a shortage. And we can measure it because it's the quantity demanded minus the quantity supplied is that horizontal distance. And there's some pressure on prices to rise. If sellers find that they can sell everything they produce, and there's people that want to buy more, they can raise their prices and still sell everything. So why not? So pressure on price, or for price to rise. And as the price starts to rise, the shortage gets smaller. There's a movement along the demand curve. The price starts to rise, and there's a movement along the supply curve. Price starts to rise, the quantity that people want to buy decreases. The quantity that the sellers want to supply increases. So that shortage gets smaller and smaller, but the price continues to rise. As long as there's a shortage, there's still pressure on prices to rise. And we can make that story that it will continue all the way up until we get to equilibrium. At equilibrium, there's no more pressure for prices to rise, and prices stop then at P star. And the shortage goes away. So there's pressure on price to rise to P star. And then once again, once we get to that equilibrium, the quantity supplied will be equal to the quantity demanded. This leads to the law of supply and demand. The law of supply and demand is that prices adjust quickly. So that the quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. So that quantity supplied and quantity demanded are equal. Once again, it's not where supply is going to be equal to demand. It's not where supply and demand are equal. It's where quantity supplied is equal to quantity demanded. The key here is that prices adjust. So in this market, to get to that equilibrium, price is changing. It's not that quantity is adjusting to get to equilibrium. It's that prices are changing that we get to equilibrium. And prices are changing and adjusting quickly. So not slow. It doesn't take a long time. It happens quickly. We don't spend too much time out of equilibrium. We're usually at equilibrium. If we're not at equilibrium, there's pressure to move to equilibrium very quickly by prices changing. So let's take an example. Let's look at computers, these desktop computers. Those are changing all the time. Let's look at the market with supply and demand. So these will be desktop computers. So we'll put price on the vertical axis. We'll put quantity of desktop computers on the horizontal axis. We've got a downward sloping demand curve. We've got an upward sloping supply curve because of the law of supply. We have an equilibrium right here where the two curves cross, and we'll call that at P star and Q star. Now suppose the demand for desktop computers falls. Why? Maybe iPads come around, or maybe the cell phones come around. Some new technology comes out. We don't need the desktop computers like we used to anymore. My phone does practically everything I used to do with a computer. So demand falls. For the desktop computers. At the same price, people don't want as many of them anymore. So demand here fell, and what happens is initially at the price of P star, there's a surplus. Now we know what's going to happen. Eventually here, there's a new equilibrium that we're going to move to right here. And we can see when that demand shifted to the left, that new equilibrium that we're going to move to is going to have a new price and a new quantity. We'll call it P star star and Q star star. At that new equilibrium, has supply changed? No. The quantity supply changes, but not supply. What's going to happen here is the old price P star is too high. Initially, there's going to be some surplus. There's pressure on prices to fall, and prices will fall all the way down to P star star, where once again, quantity supplied will be equal to quantity demanded. Whenever one of these changes, supply or demand changes, it's going to create a new equilibrium. and there's going to be a new price and a new quantity. If two of them change at the same time, if the supply changes and the demand curve changes also, we'll end up with a new equilibrium, but it's a little harder to predict exactly what's going to happen. We can usually either say something about the price or the quantity, but not both of them. If only one of these curves change, you can see, oh yeah, price is going to fall, quantity is going to fall. If the demand went up instead, we could say, oh yeah, there's a new equilibrium here, and it's a higher price and a higher quantity. And we could do the same thing with supply. A supply curve change, we can say, oh yeah, that new equilibrium from an increase in supply is going to be a higher quantity at a lower price. So one curve changes, new equilibrium, we know price is going to change and quantity is going to change, and we can see what direction it's going to be. But if both of them change at the same time, it's a little bit different and more complicated. We can either say something about how the price is going to change or how the quantity is going to change, but not both of them. Okay, so that wraps up video 3 and the module for supply and demand. We've gone through demand, the law of demand, the difference between quantity demanded and demand. We've gone through supply, the law of supply, the difference between quantity supplied and supply. We put them both together on one graph and have gone through the law of supply and demand, which is how prices change quickly to get us to an equilibrium. If we're not at equilibrium, there's a surplus or a shortage, but once we get to equilibrium, there's no longer a surplus or shortage. And of course, these supply curves and demand curves are changing for various reasons because of those factors that are held constant. And whenever any of those factors that are held constant, that will shift the supply curve or demand curve, and we'll end up at a new equilibrium.